Hi, I'm Bailey. This is what I read in March. So this year I've been trying to read 10 books a month. I overcompensated the first 2 months. In January and February I read 12 books each month. So I had like a little bit of a buffer. And in March I read 6 books, which averages out to I've been reading 10 books a month. But I did, read less than I would have wanted. But, it's just how many books I read. It doesn't matter that much. And I did really like all of the books that I read. I think it was only 4 and 5 stars, so that's always great. You want to have a good reading month, and that definitely was not the case in February or January. My average rating was a 4.67. I think it was a 6 repeating and round up. I gave 4 books 5 stars, and I gave 2 books 2 stars, so I had a great time. Nope. I gave 2 books 4 stars. Recently I've been thinking a lot about the overlaps between mystery and romance, and I think maybe I'll make a video with my thesis on that because I think it's really fun. I'm very green at the moment. The first book I read was Across Green Grass Fields by Shawnee Maguire. I am now almost completely caught up on this series. I just have the most recent book left. I had heard that this book was a lot of people's least favorite in the series, and I just do not understand that perspective. I loved this book. I think it's my 2nd or 3rd favorite in the series. I'm not entirely certain. I think my favorite is In an Absent Dream, and then Every Hearted Doorway, and then this, but I'm not sure. But Down Among the Sticks and Bones is probably next, and then Come Tumbling Down, and then Beneath the Sugar Sky, which is technically my least favorite, but I do still love it. This series is a bit odd in that every other book you can just jump in and read it without any context if you so choose. This book is one of the ones that you can just jump in and read without having read any of the other books, though I do recommend reading the other books because they are superb. But this book follows a young girl named Reagan. She's in middle school and she is trying to navigate the kind of complex world of being the best friend of the mean girl. After Reagan entrusts a secret with her mean girl best friend, her social situation changes drastically, so she runs away from school and ends up encountering a door marked "Be Sure" in the woods. Reagan goes through the door, obviously, how else would we get a plot, and enters a world full of magical creatures who are mostly equine based. While in this magical land, Reagan finds out about the political issues facing this world and the role that humans play when they show up in the world, which tends to be that of revolutionary. I had such a tremendous time reading this book. The only thing I'd really heard about this book before reading it was people like derisively calling it a horse girl book, and it is a horse girl book, but it's like, that's such a good thing. This book takes the like emotions and feelings and like social structures of young girls really seriously, and I kind of think that reducing this book to a horse girl book is kind of like rooted in misogyny a little bit, so that's how I feel. But I especially loved the beginning of this book before we go into the magical world. It's like really rooted in examining the all-consuming nature of like a toxic female friendship and how easy it is when you are so close to like the power source to just continue the status quo and not do anything to like comfort the victims of the mean girl because you are so acutely aware that you could be next and you like see the social punishment being inflicted on the other person and you don't want that. That's like such a political complex situation, and I think Maguire does a really excellent job of kind of mirroring that idea in the real world and then in the fantasy world that we approach later. But it's really interesting exploring the idea of complicity and being both complicit and a victim. I think that's interesting and nuanced, and people should love this book more. This book talks a lot about social capital and how strictly gender rules are enforced within like social circles. I just think it's like incredibly smart. I love this book. And then as we get into the fantasy world part of this story, we continue with those same themes, but add in like wonderful magic and centaurs and unicorns and all sorts of wonderful fun things. I think that the end of this book is something I really like ideologically, but like I had to really like sit on the ending and think about how I felt about it, because it was like a really great ending that I like deeply agree with, but I don't know if I wanted more from it, or if I was like, I don't know what I was expecting from the ending, and I do think that the ending matches the rest of the book perfectly. I ended up giving the book 5 stars. I didn't like dislike the ending. I just felt like the ending was not what I am used to in the end of a fantasy story. But I did really like it. I gave this book 5 stars. Clearly, I had a blast. Next up, I read Beyond the End of the World by Amy Kaufman and Megan Spooner. This book is just like so shiny and pretty. Book 1 is also very shiny and pretty. I should have grabbed book 1 before I started filming. It is kind of inaccessible to me. This is the second and final book in the Other Side of the Sky duology. The Other Side of the Sky follows North, a prince from kind of a science fiction world on like floating islands in the sky, and Nim, who is the goddess of her people down on Earth. The plot really takes off when North falls to Earth and meets Nim, who is there awaiting the fulfillment of a prophecy. The two have a lot of like really fun tension between like magic and science, and it's a really fun play on like genre bending. And they can't touch. It's very like lush and romantic and yearning, while also having a big political action-packed story. Book 1 really is very ambiguous on if it's science fiction or fantasy. The authors talk about book 2 like it doesn't answer that question. I personally felt like the question was answered, but you know, it's up to interpretation. Book 1 is fabulous, and it leaves you on like an incredible, like, I want the next part, and I was just so excited to finally get to read book 2. And you, my friend, can now read both at the same time. Not at the same time, one after another. I don't want to say too much about the book and spoil it, but I was like on tenterhooks the whole time I was reading. I was absolutely glued to this book. I had a tremendous time. I continue to love Amy Kaufman and Megan Spooner. They write wonderful, big, science fiction, fantasy, like romance, lush stories. Excellent character work. I recommend if you like YA fantasy or YA science fiction. I gave this 5 stars because I just had a tremendous time. Next up, I read The Hunting Party by Lucy Foley. This is an adult mystery thriller. This follows a group of friends who go on a group vacation every year at New Year's, and this year people get murdered. New Year's Eve is my birthday, so I do always love like a book set on my birthday. I think it's very fun. I read this book in basically like one obsessive swoop. I really like the way that Lucy Foley uses like character archetypes to play on what the reader is expecting to happen, and to really succinctly convey important character information on a lot of people very quickly, and not have it get confusing. I think that she's like very deft. I thought the way that she handled like the big reveals in this book were great. I did like guess who did it, but it wasn't one of those situations where having guessed made the reading experience like frustrating for me. Sometimes when you guess who did it in a mystery, you're just like, get to the part where you tell me I'm right so I can stop reading. And that was very much not my experience with this book. I was like delighted every time I would get another little clue and be like, see, I know I'm right. I have like lots of little notes throughout the book, just like, I got it, I'm sure, or like like second guessing myself. It was very fun. One of my very favorite mystery tropes is like group of people do something bad in the past and now they're facing the consequences of their actions. And that's not exactly what this book is. This book is just group of people have a lot of history together and now are facing something bad happening to them all, which I did think was really interesting, and it felt like familiar enough to the trope that I love. I love that group dynamic and the like terrible people thing. Not all of these people were terrible. I definitely think some of them were deeply sympathetic, and even when they did like bad things, I kind of like understood the bad thing they were doing, or I understood how they could rationalize the bad thing that they were doing, but definitely there are some like bad people in here. I will say that this book does have like a mentally ill character, and I don't think that Lucy Foley like handles it incredibly like poorly or anything, but I'm always a little iffy when somebody is the villain and mentally ill. Overall, I found this book compulsively readable. I gave it 4 stars because of my like iffiness on the mental illness representation. Again, I don't think it was like atrocious, but I was just like, oh, okay, cool. We're doing that. But like overall, I had a really fun time reading this book, and I'm very excited to read The Paris Apartment. I've already read the guest list. I thought I would go backwards before I go forwards. Next up, I picked up 9 Rules to Break When Romancing a Rake by Sarah MacLean. I've been on like a what historical romance do I actually like kick, and I really like Sarah MacLean's romance novel podcast, Fated Mates. She hosts it with Jen Prokop. It's delicious and I love it. And I've read A Rogue by Any Other Name and Bombshell by Sarah MacLean already, which were like a 3-star and a 5-star experience from me respectively. So I was like interested in how I was going to feel about this book, but it was recently repackaged. I did, spoiler alert, love this book so much I ordered the original covers on eBay so I could like read them all. So I have the original one as well. But on the podcast they did an episode about 9 Rules to Break because it has been repackaged, and I was driving to the bookstore while I was listening to this podcast to get Bridgerton, which I still haven't gotten or read or watched, because on the drive over the podcast I was like, oh okay, I'm gonna get 9 Rules to Break. Like that's probably, it was kind of 50-50, and then they put in the prologue of the audiobook and I was just immediately hooked and I had to go get the book. I think I was awake until like 3 in the morning finishing this book. This book follows Callie, who's like a 26 or 27-year-old wallflower spinster type, and the Marquis of Ralston, who is, you know, a rake. The titular Rake. When Callie's much younger sister gets engaged, she overhears people talking about her as an incredibly passive person who just like deserves happiness but will never like be brave enough to actually go change her life. This kind of gives her a bit of a kick in the ass and causes her to write a list of 9 things that she wants to do. In a fit of bravery, she decides to immediately go try to cross off one of the items on her list, which is to be kissed. She has never been kissed. She immediately sets out for the home of the local rake who she's had a bit of a crush on for years, but he has not really paid her any attention. Ralston, the rake in question, is in need of somebody with a stellar reputation to help his half-sister ease her way into London society. He agrees to help her cross off some items on her list if Callie will help his sister Juliana. I had an absolutely tremendous time reading this book. It does have a couple of flaws. This book is very long. It seems like it's going to end like twice before it actually does end. There's just like a lot of plot elements that are all packed into this book. That's not entirely a bad thing. It did make the reading experience really fun, and all of the plot elements that MacLean packs into this book are absolutely bananas and just delightful to read. My other little like critique of the book is I think some of the class commentary, feminism-y things were like a touch clunky. I don't think they were like horrible or inherently wrong or anything. I just think that it was occasionally lacking some nuance I would have liked to have seen. It wasn't offensive or dismissive. I just think that some of the way that Callie talked about her own class restrictions with being a woman weren't all that like self-aware of the way her class like privileges her. I just think some of it was very 2010s. But this book is an absolutely wild ride. The drama and romance are like turned up to 11. If you want to just like have a tremendous amount of fun with a book, I super recommend 9 Rules to Break When Romancing a Rake. I gave it 5 stars and I'm very excited to continue reading everything Sarah MacLean has published. Next up, I read an arc of the Luminaries by Susan Dennard. You should pre-order this book, it is very good. This book started on Twitter as like a choose your own adventure story. I follow the author on Twitter and I was an occasional participant, but you don't need to have like any context from the Twitter version of the story to like this story. Dennard has completely reworked the storyline from the Twitter version and made a very book-shaped object. This is a YA urban fantasy. It follows Winnie, who is a teenager who's grown up in a town run by the Luminaries, who are like a secret group of people who protect the world from these forests with magical creatures running amok every night in them. Winnie's particular forest is one of the newer forests, and their monsters are not quite as terrifying as you can find some other places in the world. But recently they seem to have maybe acquired a as yet unheard of monster. The Luminaries' nemesis are the Dianas, who are a splinter group from the Luminaries. Years previously, Winnie's father was discovered to have been a Diana, and he fled, leaving Winnie and her older brother and her mom alone, also in a lot of trouble because they are suspected of having colluded with a Diana and are thus all being kind of ostracized by the Luminaries for a 10-year period. We're about halfway through that period, but Winnie is just turned 16, and in order to be a hunter, which is what Winnie wants to be, but in order to be a hunter you have to undergo your first trial when you turn 16. So Winnie reads the rule books and sees there's nothing against somebody who is currently being punished taking their trial. So Winnie shows up to participate in a trial she is woefully unprepared for. She's kind of scoffed at, but participates anyway. This book all takes place in the week surrounding Winnie taking her first trial. There's a banshee and a werewolf and a mysterious monster, and it's just like an absolutely fun, incredible ride. I think that my favorite aspect of this book is the way that Dennard talks about kind of in-group, out-group relationships, and the way that she handles Winnie's really complicated feelings of kind of devotion to this group and also resentment because she was pushed out with her family. And Winnie saw how incredibly unfairly they treated her and her family, and how that immediately reverses upon Winnie doing like one action. Dennard writes like really empathetically and with a lot of nuance, and I think that it's just a tremendous read while also being like very exciting and action-packed. This book has great friendship dynamics, and it has a cute little like budding romance with a lot of other tension going on, and I have theories. If you like urban fantasy, if you like mysteries, if you want something kind of spooky, it's a little gory up front, but it's only a couple of times. It's very fun, comes out in November, and I highly recommend get thee to wherever you pre-order books. I gave this 5 stars. I had a great time. When it comes out, I am sure I will reread it, probably as an audiobook, because I'm curious. I think that this story will be really fun in your ears. And then the last thing I read was another historical romance. This is The Governess Game by Tessa Dare. This book follows Alexandria Mountbatten as she is an accidental governess for noted rake Chase Renaud. He has recently acquired 2 orphaned wards and has been going through governesses like crazy, and so he hires Alexandria. I tabbed throughout this book at just like lots of fun scenes, underlined lots of just absolutely delightful dialogue. Tessa Dare really is excellent at dialogue, and she writes in a very funny way. The heroine, Alexandria, is a delight. She is kind of an idealistic nerd, chases emotional trauma, is very fun to read. Watching him be like broken down by Alexandria's charms and also the charms of his two wards, who he like really wants to love but is like deeply afraid of failing them. That's my favorite hero conflict, and I think that Tessa Dare does an excellent job with it. The wards are Rosamund, who's 10, and Daisy, who is 7. Daisy has a doll named Millicent. Every morning, Millicent dies of a terrible illness, and they have a funeral. It is very quirky and cute. I think this book is great. I recommend. I gave it 4 stars. I am excited to read more Tessa Dare. Those were the 6 books I read this month. I'm trying to finish this really quick before my battery dies. I had an excellent time reading them. I do wish I'd read a little bit more, but like, it's not that big of a deal. I will read more in April, but thank you very much for watching. Bye! And the Marquis and the Marquis